On a freezing winter night, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I hesitated, wondering who could be visiting at such an hour. When I looked through the camera, I saw a police officer standing outside. Confused, I opened the door, and he said, "I found your child on the balcony, so I brought her here." I was bewildered by his words. "My daughter is asleep inside," I replied, still trying to process the situation. But as I looked at the little girl standing beside the officer, my shock deepened. She was about 5 years old, with blue lips and trembling from the cold. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her clothes were dirty and full of holes, clearly unwashed for some time. She looked so fragile, and I couldn't understand how she had ended up on my balcony. "My name is Janice," I explained. "I'm 32, and I live here with my husband and our 5-year-old daughter, Susie." My husband, often away on business trips, had been gone for a few days, leaving Susie and me alone in our first-floor apartment. That night, as the officer stood in my doorway, I felt a deep unease. "This isn't my child," I tried to explain, but the officer seemed unconvinced. "I'm taking her to the hospital," he said firmly. The girl looked so pitiful that I hurried to grab a warm blanket, wrapping it around her shivering body. Her tiny hands were like ice, and though she bit her lips to hold back tears, I could see the fear and sadness in her eyes. I couldn't shake the image of this thin, malnourished child standing there in pain, as I wondered who she was and how she had ended up on my balcony. That night, sleep eluded me as I worried about the girl. The following morning, my husband called from his trip. "Did anything unusual happen while I was away?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, still troubled. "A strange girl was on our balcony. The police took her to the hospital." He sounded frustrated. "Why didn't you take care of her yourself?" "What could I do? She's a stranger," I protested, confused by his reaction. "You're a mother too," he chided. "You should have taken care of that little girl instead of handing her over to the police." His words left me baffled. How did he know she was so young? We hadn't discussed that detail. I pressed him for answers, but his explanations were vague and unsettling. "No, actually, she's the daughter of an acquaintance," he finally admitted. "Her mother is gone, and I felt sorry for her, so I brought her yesterday. I thought you would take care of her." "What?" I was stunned. "You weren't on a business trip. Explain this situation clearly." My husband apologized, but I couldn't believe he had left such a small child on the balcony in the dead of winter. Even if she had been warmly dressed, she could have frozen to death. "What are you doing, and where are you now?" I demanded. He claimed he was searching for the girl's mother, but his evasive answers made me suspicious. When he returned from his supposed business trip, he offered only brief explanations before picking up the girl from the police and leaving her with me. "Did you find her mother? What about her father?" I asked, still searching for clarity. "I haven't found them yet. As for her father, I don't know," he said, his voice evasive. "That acquaintance I mentioned, let's leave it at that. I have another business trip soon." "Wait a minute," I protested. "What about this girl?" My husband ignored my plea to stay and left, leaving the girl behind. Something about his behavior felt off, so I searched through his belongings. In the inner pocket of his suit, I found something shocking. I quickly tried to call him, but he didn't answer. As I stood there, my daughter Susie and the little girl looked up at me anxiously. "What's your name?" I asked softly. "Ashley," she answered nervously in a small voice. She was the same age as Susie, just 5 years old. When I smiled gently at her, she seemed surprised, but then she laughed cheerfully, clutching her rumbling stomach. "You must be hungry, right?" "Yes," she replied. I made Hawaiian plate lunches for Susie and Ashley. They stared at the food curiously before devouring it, eating so quickly that their faces were soon covered in sauce. When I reached out to wipe Ashley's face with a tissue, she quickly raised her hands to her head, as if to protect herself. The motion gave me an uneasy feeling. "It's all right, I'm just going to wipe your mouth," I said gently. She looked relieved and allowed me to clean her up, then continued eating with renewed enthusiasm. After finishing their meals, both girls looked completely satisfied. Seeing Ashley's dirty appearance, I decided it was time to clean her up. As I began to undress her for a shower, I gasped involuntarily. Her body was covered in countless bruises, as if she had been beaten and pinched. Trying to hide my agitation, I cheerfully led her to the bathroom. As I prepared to wash her, Ashley said, It's okay, I can do it myself, and began washing with cold water. Wait a minute, what are you doing? I accidentally snapped. Ashley looked up at me with a puzzled expression. Ashley always does it like this, she said. Washing with cold water? I asked. She nodded, and as she tried to pour the cold water over herself, I hurriedly stopped her. I washed her entire body with warm, soapy water instead. As I poured the warm water over her, she murmured, "It's warm," with a contented look on her face. It turned out that she rarely got to shower at home, and when she did, her mother made her wash with cold water. The fact that she accepted this as normal without questioning it made my heart ache. After her bath, I dressed Ashley in Susie's clothes and neatly arranged her hair. She looked completely transformed. When Susie and Ashley stood together, they looked just like sisters. As I watched them, I couldn't help but notice how much they resembled each other, and it warmed my heart. Ashley was an obedient and gentle child, clearly longing for affection. She would come by my side as I cooked, tugging at the edge of my skirt, and when it was time for bed, she would hold my hand and never let go. Susie also grew fond of Ashley, and the two became as close as real sisters. A week passed, and I still couldn't reach my husband. Ashley's mother had said she knew him, but with so little information, I couldn't keep caring for a child without more answers. Eventually, I gave up on contacting my husband and consulted the police. Ashley was sent to a facility, and as they took her away, tears rolled down her big eyes. My heart ached as I watched her look back at me again and again. Time continued to pass without any word from my husband until I finally made a decision. 9 years later, I was living with my parents, Susie, and Ashley in our family home. I had adopted Ashley after she was taken to the facility, and my parents treated her like their own grandchild, believing she had come to us for a reason. They showered her with love. Susie and Ashley grew up as sisters, blossoming into beautiful young women. Their dream of becoming models came true, and they were now being featured as junior models in magazines, stepping into the glamorous world with vibrant expressions on their faces. One day, the doorbell rang at our family home. When I opened the door, there stood my ex-husband, Philip, looking poor and down and out. A stranger who introduced herself as Joanna was with him. Not wanting to cause a scene in front of the neighbors, I led them inside. As we sat on a living room sofa, the two abruptly began to speak. In truth, Ashley is my child, Philip, who hadn't contacted me in 9 years, said without even apologizing. I was so stunned that I let out a big sigh. She looks just like you. I thought it might be you. So, is that woman over there your partner? I asked, trying to process the situation. Philip nodded and began to tell the story of how he met Joanna. She had been working part-time at a bar Philip frequently visited. Despite knowing he was married with children, they got along, and Joanna became pregnant with Philip's child, eventually giving birth to Ashley. However, Philip lacked decisiveness and didn't divorce me right away. Joanna grew tired of caring for Ashley and abandoned her role as a mother. In desperation, Philip thought of having me raise the child. It was a far-fetched plan, but what surprised me most wasn't just that. "Please give Ashley back to us." My ex-husband suddenly stood up from the sofa, making an outrageous request, almost in tears, and offered a deep apology. What? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I happened to see a magazine and was surprised. "She's grown up so well. Isn't she popular?" he said, his tone almost pleading. "So what? That has nothing to do with you two," I replied, my voice laced with anger. "But I am Ashley's real mother." "You're just a fake," Jonah interjected. "How dare you say such a thing without contacting me all this time?" I retorted, my patience wearing thin. Then, as if sensing my growing frustration, Philip, who had been on his knees on the floor, grabbed my leg with a pathetic look on his face. "We don't have any money and are in trouble. Ashley's our only hope. Give her back." "How awful. You plan to make her work and live off her." "No way," I shouted, feeling a surge of anger. "What? You're using Ashley to make money, aren't you?" "That's not fair," Philip accused, his desperation evident. "Stop making false accusations. I'm saving the children's money in their bank accounts. Ashley is my child too, and I will never hand her over," I declare firmly. Suddenly, Jonah rose from the sofa, lunging at me with a reckless air that sent a shiver down my spine. "What are you doing to my mom?" "Stop it." Ashley's voice rang out as she burst into the scene. She spread her arms wide, blocking my path, and glared at Jonah. Ashley, you've grown so beautiful. Remember me? I'm your mom. Let's go home together, Jonah said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. You're not my mother. Get out of this house now. Ashley screamed, tears streaming down her face as she clung to me. Although Ashley was very young at the time, it seemed she still faintly remembered the terrible treatment she had endured. Ashley, dear, that's just a misunderstanding on your part. You were so young back then, Jonah tried to explain, her words flimsy and unconvincing. In response, I pulled out a note and photograph I had found in Philip's suit back then. The note read, Asterisk, I don't want to raise a child. I can't find Ashley cute. Get rid of her somewhere. If you won't marry me, let's run away together. Asterisk. The photograph showed a young Ashley covered in bruises. I also had a hospital medical report. Do you still claim to be her parents after seeing this? I demanded, my voice cold and steady. That's, Jonah stammered, her confidence crumbling. You wanted to dump a child you didn't want to raise on me, didn't you? You made this precious child suffer such horrors, I accused. That was all Philip's doing. I didn't know anything about it. I was too young to raise a child. It was inevitable. But anyway, I'll take Ashley back now, Jonah said, her voice trembling. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. I have legally adopted Ashley, so I am her parent, I stated firmly. What? That has to be a lie. Jonah's bravado quickly deflated at the mention of the law, but Philip seemed determined not to give up yet. So if that's the case, I'll break up with Joanna and let's start over. Susie and Ashley are my children. We'll just go back to being husband and wife. So there won't be any problem, will there? Philip proposed, his words absurd and desperate. What are you saying? You just want things to go your way. Like I will let that happen. Joanna snapped back, her anger rising. Listening to their exchange, I was first dumbfounded, then furious. I don't want to have anything to do with either of you, not even for a moment, I said, my voice filled with resolve. I have more bad news for you, Philip. You and I are no longer married. 3 years after you went missing, I filed a lawsuit and was granted a divorce. What? What are you doing on your own? Philip shouted, trying to grab me, but just then the sound of a police car approached. My parents had called the police after witnessing Joanna's aggressive behavior. The police are here now, so please don't come to our house again, I said firmly. No way. Please forgive me. I'll give up on Ashley, but at least lend me some money, Philip pleaded, putting on a disgraceful show to the very end. Afterwards, Philip and Joanna were dragged away by the police. I planned to make sure Philip paid the alimony and child support in full. The two of them, cut off even from friends and family, would likely continue to struggle. Though there had been much turmoil, the little girl who once trembled in fear had grown into a splendid young woman. I would live happily with my parents and 2 loving daughters, looking forward to the future they spoke of so full of dreams.